Rachel, I'm sure, will come now to the lectern. And Rachel, I think, hardly needs any introduction to you. She is the chair of the Times Education Commission and a political columnist at the Times. She started writing about politics in '96 and was a lobby correspondent on the Daily Telegraph before becoming political editor of The Independent on Sunday. She also presents the Times radio podcast Past Imperfect with Alice Thompson, and they've recently published a book based on their interviews called What I Wish I Had Known When I Was Young, a perfect introduction for our panel debate today. Rachel, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, and it's great to be here. There is just such a compelling case for reform on assessment. And the Times Education Commission heard so much evidence from business, from head teachers, teachers, and parents and young people about the economic case, the fairness case, the equality case, and of course the well-being case. But what's so exciting about this event is that it's about implementation, and I think there is an appetite for reform among the politicians. So both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have responded incredibly positively to our proposals on the Times Education Commission, and I think they are looking for ideas for the manifestos and for the next government. So I think there's a real opportunity to shape the political debate if you can come up with proposals that seem practical and achievable, which is what is so exciting about today. So I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, actually. The subject of our discussion is how do you make change happen, which couldn't be more important. So could I start with Sally?
Do I need to do? Is that okay? Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Sally Dicketts, or actually James Dicketts now. First time I've used it. It's okay. Story of my life. I always touch everything and ruin it. I have spent 45 years as a teacher, then as a senior leader in schools, and latterly for the last 18 years before I left, I was in charge of Activate Learning, which ran 7 further education colleges, 7 schools, and also worked internationally, including running 4 female colleges in Saudi Arabia. I was the president of the Association of Colleges up until November, and I am now sitting on various panels, one of which is rethinking assessment. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I just want to challenge Andrew. I'm actually a very failed learner, but more about that later.
Chris.
So, morning everybody. My name is Chris Husbands. My current job, I'm Vice-Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam University, one of the country's largest, most diverse universities, 36,000 students. We attract more students from disadvantaged backgrounds than any other university in the country. I've got a long history in education policy and implementation. I was previously Director of the Institute of Education at University of London, and I've been engaged in different ways with the issues that we're talking about today for more years than I care to remember.
April.
Hello, I'm April McMahon, and I'm Vice President for Teaching, Learning and Students at the University of Manchester, which is an institution about the size of a big town or a small city. We've got about 45,000 students and 12,000 staff. And if you can make change happen in that lot, then we probably have some discussions that we can contribute. I'm not saying we're there, but we're thinking about it, and we're doing it, as you can probably see by the number of Manchester colleagues who are presenting or participating in the event today. And it's fantastic to be part of a gathering that brings together all of our education sector, because part of our problem in this domain of assessment is that there's some vested interests that like to play us off against each other, and maybe that's something we'll get to as we discuss.
Jane, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Thank you. So I'm Jane Walton. I'm here today representing the Federation of Small Businesses. I come from a slightly different angle, but if I just give some context, our membership is around 160,000, many of whom are small to medium-sized enterprises and many of whom are sole traders. In order to be the chair of education policy nationally, you have to be self-employed. So I come representing our membership, but unusually, I have to say, with the Federation of Small Businesses and many business organisations, my business is education. So I am by trade an adult education tutor. I have been a chair of governors, school governors and college governors, and I am also a chair and a trustee on a number of educational charities. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to start by asking the panel what your concerns are about the current system and how you'd like to see it reformed from your different worlds and perspectives. Jane, do you want to start? Because I think there's a really interesting business case for reform.
Thank you for that, for the opportunity as well. So I could share with you my very personal view, but I have to say it has to be backed up by evidence, as we all know. And we were fortunate in although we didn't want to bother our members too much with questions about education and skills during the pandemic, because of course they have other things to focus on, particularly in terms of survival. We were fortunate last summer to be able to go back to our membership and ask them about their views, particularly in relation to skills, the skills they felt they needed, and any challenges that they were experiencing in recruitment in particular. The responses we got weren't surprising, and I always say I probably can write half of the report before I read it, because my views are reflective of our membership views. So for a long time there's been a view that the challenges within business, some of which are related to recruitment, so that our employers are not seeing people with the qualifications they expect. Now, some of that is because their experience of qualifications, I have to say, slightly out of touch in terms of it relates to their experience, and they don't always appreciate and understand, what's going on in education today. The other thing, of course, is their businesses in some cases have moved on, particularly in terms of technology, and in a lot of cases they're not seeing that reflected in what they feel the skills are being presented to them when they're recruiting. But that's the technical skills. The rest of their needs and their challenges tend to be around the things that we've already heard mentioned today, which are the non-technical skills: communication, interpersonal skills, resilience, problem solving, teamwork. I'm sure none of you are surprised by that, but their frustration is that when they look at a CV or an application form, it's very difficult to judge whether or not a young person is competent in their areas. They get a lot more from an interview process, but it's whether or not that young person is skilled then in responding in such a way that enables them to present the evidence of their competence in those areas. My work focuses very much on young people and young adults who have struggled with education and need to present their experience in different ways. So I'm challenged constantly by the ways of looking at new ways of assessing that. And I have to say, I am a fellow of the RSA, listening to Andy in terms of thinking about how we use technology and digital to assess those skills, but also how we enable young people to present those skills. So the challenges are traditional, I have to say. Not a lot has changed in most of the aspects of the challenges that employers face, but they are aware that there are needs for change, but most of them don't get involved, as I do, in the, if you like, minutiae of that. Just a final note to say, although there are challenges, lots of challenges, our employers do want to be engaged. Before the pandemic, I would say a third of our membership were engaged actively in education. It's reduced now, but it's coming back, and only yesterday we were encouraged by our members being asked to engage with education again in terms of encounters for teachers to learn more about what's going on in the world of work and employment. And for the first time, green skills has raised its head in terms of our employers recognising that green skills are something that they were looking for in the next generation. So thank you.
Really interesting. Sally, one of the things that shocked me most on the Education Commission was the idea that a third of children effectively fail their GCSEs and are being written off. Do you think there's a system that would better draw out the talent of all pupils than the current one?
I think any system would be better than the one we have at the moment. It reminds me of the system I undertook in the 70s, which certainly failed me, but I was lucky enough to come from a lower middle class background, so my parents saved me. I think if I look at further education, I would ask all of you, would you like a plumber that can write you a stunning essay on how to plumb your house? Or would you like somebody who could come and actually do it? And if we're not careful, we're so obsessed by written work, and I'm not saying it's not important, but for me, we have no hope in our education system if you fail. So in an FE college, the biggest exams most students do are English and maths because they failed it. And the way your brain works is it switches off, prefrontal cortex closes down when you're under any stress. So as soon as you failed an exam 4 or 5 times, certainly it worked brilliantly for me. I failed my 11 plus so stunningly because I never answered a question. My early career was spent in a remedial stream. So you give up hope, you do not work. And I believed your brain was a bucket. So I had a small bucket. Why in the hell would I learn or learn how to learn? There was absolutely no point whatsoever. So I became an incredible daydreamer. And I'm very imaginative, creative, and see connections where others don't. None of which was valued. And in fact, I was told I was thick but very sociable. The kids that I meet, and I met a group of them last week, and we were discussing creativity. None of them felt they were doing any creativity in any of the courses they were doing, and they were a vast range. We then met a group of employers, and this did shock me. The biggest complaint they made for both graduates and non-graduates was their inability to both give and receive feedback. Very able kids that were given feedback that they thought was negative, put them in a downspin. They thought they were failing and maybe they should change careers. They didn't know how to do it. So for me, our education system should inspire hope for everyone. And I think we had a learning philosophy at Activate Learning, which is your brain is a muscle, it's not a bucket. The harder it works, the cleverer you become. Where is hard working anywhere in any of our values? And particularly now, given the situation we're in post-COVID, for me, hard work is really important. And if a student gets an A by doing nothing, to me, I wouldn't give them a star. I would give them a star for the things they struggle and work hard. So that's your brain. If you don't understand why you're learning, and young people today want to know why they're doing something, why are you going to be motivated to learn? And the third and most important thing for both employers and all of us is, are you creating an emotional environment where your brain is open to learning? And I think if we did all of that, is it possible? Absolutely. Do we ever ask the end user what they want, i.e. our students? How often have you, and follow a student for a day? I have a very short attention span. And to be honest, after I followed one of our students for a day, I felt like shooting my brains out. And we therefore re-looked at the curriculum. So what are we doing and how are we rewarding creativity, hard work, kindness? I would ask you all to read Mo Gadat's book on Scary Smart. If we're not kind, the computers we've got, if they do become truly sentient by 2050, they will solve sustainability because they will annihilate us. If we're kind from now on and they learn from how we interact on the airwaves, then they will solve the problem. How kind are we in social media? Because we're educating the next generation of computers. I think there's some really interesting, and I do think change is possible if we include our students and we change with them and we become flexible and we measure the whole person, not part of them.
That's so interesting. Chris, I was also struck when we were doing the Education Commission. Mary Beard, the classicist from Cambridge, was one of the people who gave evidence, and she said it's not just the forgotten third who are losing out. Actually, some of the brightest students who are going to Cambridge to study classics, they're arriving and they say to her, how do I get a first? What's the mark scheme to get me a first? And she said, no, you've got to think until your brain hurts. And there'd been a total loss of creativity and sort of curiosity in the last 20 years, she said, in her students. How do you think, what are the problems from the point of view of the university sector, and what do you think needs to change?
So, be interested, April and I represent quite different parts of the university sector. It turns out I think we're going to agree on almost everything that we say. I think there's an element that we are here and should be as sinners who repent, because it's worth remembering that the examination system that we have was by and large geared around selecting a small minority for university entrance. That's what A-levels were created for. O-levels were then constructed on a model that prepared students for A-levels. GCSEs was with the inheritance of both. And in some respects, that sort of worked when you were aiming to take a relatively small minority through. The absurdity of the system that we now have is that the higher the level of your educational attainment, the easier it is to navigate the system. The lower the level of your educational attainment, the more difficult and confusing it is. And that picks up some of the points that Andy was making earlier. Looking at the students we recruit, so I'll put this very sharply. I think increasingly recruit students who are not equipped to think broadly, not equipped to think transdisciplinarily, not equipped to problem solve, and with increasing and escalating mental health challenges, accelerated by the pandemic, but not created by the pandemic. Very much thinking they are attuned to think about what the next step is, 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 and not necessarily equipped for the deep learning and the deep engagement that we really need students to see and to deliver. As a nation, we've sacrificed breadth for depth, flexibility for drilling, accountability for assessment. I don't think we're preparing young people either for the way they'll work, or we need to, HE is not a jobs factory, we need to listen hard to employer voices, but not in preparing them for the sort of world that we are going to want them to engage with as citizens, as adults. And that's, I think, as you're right, Rachel, it's challenging. It's not simply the bottom third in terms of attainment, it's the entire range that we have to address.
So interesting. April, how much appetite do you think there is for reform among educators, whether that's schools, colleges or universities? Because some people would say, you've just been through the pandemic, we've got public sector pay squeeze, teachers going on strike. Is there actually sort of mental space for reform at the moment?
Well, it's a game of two halves. I've got some colleagues who genuinely believe that the closed book exam is magic. In every sense of the word, it's fabulous. It's the shiniest thing that you can get students to do. Students, on the whole, don't believe that. There's the odd few who know that they're jolly good at it, but equally they're the ones who are frozen with horror when you put them in a group work or an interview situation. So we're not being fair to anybody. Now, the pandemic, although I wouldn't advocate, the world going on fire particularly, but how do we use what we learned from the pandemic? And it's like a piece of elastic. You stretch it really tight. It's true. If you let it go, it'll ping back to where it was. What people like Chris and I are doing in universities is hanging on to that bit of elastic for dear life and saying, we're not going back to where we were before. And that's because during COVID, you couldn't do the magic. We couldn't do the closed book exams, but the magic still happened in the sense that we actually graduated fantastic students. They went into great jobs and employers liked them just as well, if not a little bit better. So there are, let me do the caveat. there are cases where actually it's really important that people are trained to get stuff out of their brain and apply it instantly under stress. I quite like my pharmacists to be able to figure out how much of a drug they're going to give a child without having to pop in the back room and look something up. But those cases are few and far between. And the case for, let's say, historians having to spill stuff out of their heads under stress as the main means of assessment is not as strong as it is for pharmacists. And for pharmacists, they need to do the group work and so on as well. So what we've done at Manchester is we've said, go back to basics. What do we want assessment to be? And we reckon what we want it to be is inclusive. So that's right at the top. Students came to me after the pandemic with disabilities, and they said, this is the first time in my educational journey I have been treated like everybody else, and not told, you have to go over there because you're different. Actually, we're all online and we're all doing things in the same way. Some of us might take a little bit longer. Nobody knows that, though. So we want it to be inclusive. We want it to be authentic. So we want it to be work relevant and to support students to actually come out as graduates who can do the group work. And we want it to be trustworthy. That can be the sticky bit, but a lot of this is about educating students that, you know, you might get away with something in terms of one particular assessment, but you're going to be rumbled by the balance of assessment that we do across the piece. And me personally, it's a bigger deal for me to get the inclusive and the authentic bit, and we still need to work on elements of the trustworthy. So there's a distance to go, but there is an appetite. In all of these cases, and you know this better than I do, use your students if you've got issues with your staff, because actually having those students saying, this is what we want, we understand the value of it, and our alumni are very close to that student perspective, and many of them are employers. That's how we make the change happen.
So interesting. Chris, how do you think that trust aspect should be dealt with? So we heard from Tony Blair, who said he wanted to introduce a baccalaureate when he was in government, and he didn't because the universities blocked it. They said it wasn't sufficiently rigorous. And actually, I think that's changed. Certainly the universities we spoke to were, if any, equally or if not more enthusiastic about a broader education.
I did read the Blair comment. He might not be the first politician to perhaps pretend that other people's objections were in the way of things that he might have wanted to do. I think that trust is really important. I was actually just going to come in a slightly different direction. In the world of polycrises, we're all used to being bowled curveballs and working out what on earth do we do about them. ChatGPT is the curveball that I imagine everybody is trying to scratch their head about. And it could play out in a number of different ways. And one of them is that it might actually force, and I can see a rather conservative approach emerging in response to AI that says the only thing we can rely on is the in-person examination in an examination room with a pen and a piece of paper. But if you think about it, what that will do is to create such a divorce between the world of the examination room and the rest of the world, which means that the authenticity of what you're getting out of the exam room has a lower validity. My next door neighbours came around for a cup of tea on Sunday afternoon, and one of our neighbours is a research biologist. She had put the abstract for her latest paper, or she'd asked ChatGPT to write an abstract for the latest research paper that should be used. It came out better than the one that she had prepared for the paper. This is the world that we've got to live for. And if we don't hang on to engaging different perspectives, listening to students, listening to partners, and working out what does authentic information about capabilities look like in a world of AI. And I don't have a clear answer to that. We've got some people working on that back at Hallam as of about 10 days ago. But that's the question. You've got to frame the question properly in the context of the world in which we're operating and not in a world as it used to exist.
Thank you. Sally, how do you think the different parts of the education world can work together? So there's always such a divide between schools, colleges and universities. Is there a way in which you can all come together on assessment reform?
I certainly think there is, and it is something that fascinates me. So when I retired from my day job, one of my aims was actually to sit in primary, secondary, further and higher education, which I've now achieved. So I'm doing work in all four. And I would say that it's because of the silos. I would say schools, colleges and universities do want to work together. I actually haven't found on the university, colleges or schools that I am part of now any resistance. The resistance is time, what they're measured by, how they're funded. So I think schools would love to do more with colleges and improve their students' life chances. So would colleges, so would universities. But if you are, and we've heard of all the things that are really important to universities, all the things that are important to colleges and schools, how do we bring the three together? I think assessment isn't that different, certainly not in schools and colleges. Universities have more flexibility, but I think it is hugely possible to also make it more relevant for young people, so they actually see a step ladder in their assessment rather than the rapidity of I did X in school, I'm now doing Y in college, and when I go to university, particularly in my first year, I seem to repeat what I'm doing. I'm not being extended. But I think space needs to be created for it, and there needs to be a will on the part of policymakers and funders in order to make that happen.
Jean, I wonder what the role of business might be in all of this, and I wonder also whether that could be a way of winning some of the political arguments, if there could be some almost institutionalized input from business at all levels into the assessment system that makes the case that that gets around some of these sort of gold standard arguments.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said in my introduction, I am heartened by the willingness of employers and businesses to engage. Not all of them, and I know there'll be people out there sat there, we've tried and it's really difficult. It is. But I'm very pleased to say through Andy's work that the RSA, recognises the world of business isn't the enemy. It isn't to be, feared and to be suspicious about. It's actually a key partner. And, we've shown through the FSB's work the impact that particularly small and medium-sized enterprises have on their community, and they want to make a difference in their community. But it's about helping them to understand what is required and to ask them to get involved in a way that is for them relevant. Now, I get involved, as maybe a number of people in the room do, every year, it feels like sometime every week, in mock interviews, looking at young people's CVs, talking to young people about their aspirations. And recently, only yesterday, as I say, I did see coming out of the work of the Careers and Enterprise company, where I am on their advisory board, the fact that teachers in the main don't feel able to give the kind of careers information that young people need in relation to more technical and vocational routes, and particularly, and this is a particular bugbear of mine, in relation to self-employment. So next week I will be having a Zoom call with a young man who's been running his business at the age of 14 for 2 years very successfully. I've helped him to make sure it's legal and official and to give him the support he needs. He hasn't found that support in school. And I'm not surprised. So I'm really concerned about the next generation of entrepreneurs. I am a little bit, the way I play with that is that I call myself a social entrepreneur. It's been a bit provocative because I used to work with Peter Jones. So I do that for a particular reason. But I'm concerned not only with the young people in terms of the world of work and going forward and how employers might be engaged in that, but also how we create the next generation of entrepreneurs.
Interesting. Sally, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I think employers, in my experience, have been amazing, and the amount of time and effort they are prepared to put into. So we ran some programs for Amy, specialist subjects. They actually, we trained their staff to teach. They actually taught the very specialist. Scania ran projects with our 16, 17-year-olds when they were redoing all of the roundabouts in Oxford, and our students actually worked on live projects. They actually took them to see what their measurements and what they had suggested and where it had worked, it didn't. We had UTC students at 14 working on Reading Station when it was being developed, assessed by the employers. And one of the big things the employers fed back to us is oracy needs to be taught, that their oracy skills were not good enough, although their written skills, ironically, were strong enough. And the second thing that was very galling for the teachers is when the employers said, well, this is how you have to dress and turn up. The students listened. They did not listen to the teachers. I think, in a way, we don't ask enough of employers. We don't respect them enough. And as I say, I have never, ever been refused by any employer, and their contribution has been phenomenal.
That's great. We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to quickly ask each member of the panel for one thought on what schools, colleges, universities can do while the politicians continue to faff around. If anything. Sally's actually had a couple of ideas there, oracy and presentation. But April.
United Front. We in universities are constantly being told you can't do all this innovation stuff, the schools won't wear it, and I bet you're being told the same thing in schools about the universities. So United Front working together on why innovation actually is a really good positive thing. If you look back at golden ages, they tend to be a bit tarnished round the edges, and the golden age of the closed book exam has exactly that appearance, I think. So the more that we can talk about personalisation, we heard about that this morning, and the more that we can do that in a united and forward-looking way and with employers, too, the better chance we have politically.
Chris, thank you.
So just want to go back to the point you raised about Tony Blair, 2004, not taking the baccalaureate option. My understanding is that the reason is it was too politically scary. That it looked as though it was going to draw down a heck of a lot of press criticism on end of standards and end of A-levels. So there's a lesson there. No politician is ever going to get involved in the technical detail, thank goodness. We have to make it easy for them. We have to demonstrate that it can work. We have to demonstrate that it does not mean a decline in excellence, a decline in standards, all the things that we can imagine. The first bit of media training I ever went on, somebody told me that I absolutely had to force myself to read the Daily Mail once a month to understand. But all the things that we know is going to come from that direction. We as the profession have got to make the route map forward easy so that it then becomes the obvious thing to do rather than the scary thing to do.
Interesting. Sally?
I would say trust, take risk, and I would start with creativity across the curriculum, and also holistic learning. There's a lovely book where they describe teaching, it's an American book, young boys and girls, baseball, and that you wouldn't start by spending the first year hitting a bat, then the second year running around the pitch, and in the third year you throw the ball, and it's not until you hit the fifth year that you actually play a game, because everybody would be bored and not engaged. That's our education system. Make it whole and include the whole child.
Jane?
Yes, I'm just going to relay a little anecdote to you. I'm a school governor in a primary school in my own community. The biggest employer is the NHS, the local trust, and we have a lovely group across the year groups called the Planet Savers. They named themselves. And they asked if they could talk to an employer about what they were doing about sustainability. So we invited the head of sustainability from the Mid Yorkshire Trust, I will name them. He came into school, he gave them a lovely talk. and they shared with him their audit tool that they have developed for school. He's taken it away to use it in the NHS. And for me, that holistic approach, give students, young people, the opportunity to be involved and to be engaged and to come up with the solutions and teach them to learn. Not what to learn, but how to learn.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panel, and I hope the rest of the day is as interesting.